Chapter 6. The night of the feast had arrived. The throne room had been given a makeover. The leaking ceiling had been bunged up with rags, newspaper and sticky tape. Coloured ribbons and silk streamers ran from pillar to pillar, creating a rainbow of floating fabric, and flowers sprouted from brightly painted pots. The army of cut-out guards had gone, and richly embroidered tapestries depicting historical scenes of previous cragflinging events adorned the walls. The long banqueting table looked resplendent. Bowls of colourful exotic fruit and earthenware vases stuffed with breadsticks, celery and strange flowering vegetables were lined up and down the centre. Silver platters were laden with glistening cold meats and ripe cheeses of every variety imaginable. Sliced fruit, crispy snacks and thick dips were included in the amazing spread. Werble nuts, a delicacy as far as every crag in Gud was concerned, were piled up in an enormous dish in one corner of the room. Suspended above the long table were ornate wrought iron lamp holders with stubby tallow candles. They burned brightly, casting a warm, yellowish tinge around the room. The feast was lavish. The king could ill afford it, but he knew it was essential in order to attract the finest contestants from across the land. Competitors would be expected to stump up a considerable fee to take part in the royal tournament, and some of this would help pay for the banquet, and some would make up the prize pot of 1,000 gudders. There were 13 place settings in all, including one at the head of the table for King Guddamac. His throne had been elevated to give him an air of authority. Its golden frame gleamed in the candlelight, and like his crown, he hoped that no one would guess it was an imitation. The original had been sold many moons ago to repair the collapsed Western Tower. Most citizens knew that without more money the rickety seat of Gud would simply crumble to dust. There was much riding on the success of the national sport this year. Groggins was fidgeting with napkins at one end of the table while instructing a number of young girls to lay cutlery in the correct way. The girls had been hired from the villages to act as waitresses for the evening. Freckles and Lucy Longtrousers were among them, and a smart, freshly pressed, matching blouse and skirt replaced their shabby pinafores.
"I wouldn't mind tucking into this, Nosh," Freckles said, licking her lips. "Too right. Do you think we could get Splidge to smuggle some out to us later?" Lucy Longtrousers eyed up a delicious cream-covered carrot cake. A blob of wax landed with a splodge on the tablecloth, and both girls instinctively looked up. Dangling from one of the rafters, Snotty was lighting the candles with a long, slender match.
"Hey, chuck up a bread roll and a lump of cheese, would you? My tummy is rumbling something rotten looking at all that grub."
"No, get it yourself." Freckles wagged her finger.
"We're not supposed to eat on the job, you nit."
Snotty poked his tongue out and grimaced at the girls. He rummaged in his pocket and pulled out an ancient lump of mouldy chocolate and stuffed it in his mouth, then clambered off behind a large oak beam to sulk. Down in the palace hallway, the competitors had started to arrive. They were dressed in their official cragflinging outfits. Some wore tunics with sashes across the front, while others had tassels around their waist, and one chap wore a brass helmet with a plume of feathers sprouting out the top. Their crags, tucked under their arms, were decorated as if mini versions of their owner. Freckles and Lucy Longtrousers were told to leave the banqueting hall and hurry down to the lower level, where they were given the job of handing out sparkling wine to all the guests. Champagne corks popped and fluted glasses filled with bubbly.
"Where's Splidge?" Freckles asked.
"I dunno, I can't see him,"
replied Lucy Longtrousers.
"Trust him to be late."
Splidge wasn't late. He was getting ready in a side room. Earlier that day, Splidge had been summoned to the throne room by the king and taken to a staircase he hadn't seen before.
"I'm going to send you to the highest turret in the tallest tower," the king told him.
"Oh,"
Splidge said nervously. "Have I done something wrong? Do you want me out of the way?"
No, nothing like that," laughed the king. "I just need you to fetch something. Look at me, I can't squeeze through the archway or climb the wretched stairs, but a small, sprightly chap like you can whiz up there in no time."
Splidge found it difficult to imagine there was ever a time when the king was thin enough to slip through the arched entrance, never mind climbing steep winding stairs. The king continued,
"There is something I need to give you for tonight's festivities. You'll find a room at the top, and in it a special wooden cabinet. Take these keys and bring the contents of the cabinet down to me."
Splidge nodded at the cryptic request and set off up the tower. The temperature inside the stairwell was much lower than any other part of the palace, and the occasional arrow slit barely provided any light at all. If Splidge's eyes could penetrate the gloom, he would have been repelled by the oozing slime dribbling from the crumbling sandstone and the sticky slug trails smeared across the half-moon-shaped steps as they wound around the central column. The decaying rope handrail looped through wobbly eyelets, helping the boy find his way. The repeated slog of winding incrementally around the endless spiral in the near darkness did little to combat his sense of foreboding. The sound of scurrying rats, flapping bats, and slithering who knows what made the ascent all the more nerve-wracking. More than once, Splidge found himself entangled in a thick mass of cobwebs spanning the narrow shaft, and shivering he groped through the spider's handiwork. Evidently no one had been up this tower for years. He eventually made it to the top and found a small metal door. In the tiniest shaft of light from a conveniently positioned arrow slit, Splidge located the lock. It took some effort to persuade the key to turn, and the mechanical clunk created a macabre echo as the bolts slid back. Splidge was fearful of what lay beyond the door, and his imagination conjured up ghastly images. He saw a sleeping dragon, angered by his sudden arrival, spraying him with fire and brimstone. He pictured a cackling witch stirring a boiling cauldron, watched over by her sisters on flying broomsticks, while a serpent laughed from within the scalding water. Blotting the images from his mind, Splidge shoved the heavy door and barged in. He squinted and held up his hands in front of his face to protect his eyes from the bright light. But it wasn't coming from the torch of a cycloptic giant or the magic wand of a wicked witch. It was simply daylight streaming through 8 windows that encircled the octagonal room. Splidge poked his head out of one of the windows. He couldn't see the ground. It was enough to make his stomach lurch, and he thought he might be sick. It may not have been a big room, but it was high up, and he hated heights. In the middle stood a solitary piece of furniture made of dark oak bound together with metal braces. Splidge approached the cabinet, wondering what could be so special that it required keeping in such a secretive place. He turned the key and opened the door. A thick cloud engulfed the boy, and he sneezed several times. It was raining hard as the guests arrived in their ornate and distinguished carriages. A thunderstorm was brewing. Occasional flashes streaked across the sky, followed by ominous rumblings from miles away. Gob waited in the porch as each carriage came to a stop and the occupants vacated. He led the horses to a row of ramshackle sheds, once upon a time the much-envied royal stables, and he attached nose-bags to each of their heads. Once the wet canvas livery, with the competitor's crest emblazoned on the corner, had been hung up to drip dry, the animals were brushed down. Gob gave a running commentary to the horses as he worked, happy to chat to anyone who would listen, even if they did have 4 legs and could only neigh in reply. Counting the horses, he calculated that everyone had arrived, with the exception of one.
Back at the reception area, sparkling wine was flowing, and the cragflingers were relaxing and making small talk with one another. Some were catching up with old friends or past rivals, while others were eyeing up new opponents. Freckles and Lucy Longtrousers were busy filling champagne glasses at a trestle table. "Have you seen Splidge?" asked Freckles, craning her neck to see if she could spot him among the cragflingers. Lucy Longtrousers shook her head and offered a glass of effervescent bubbles to a spotty fat boy. He wasn't much older than her, and judging from his superior quality of his attire, he was obviously a wealthy cragflinger. "Smile, Lucy," whispered Freckles. "That's the Prince of Pimpleton." "Prince of where?" Lucy giggled. "Well, it was something like that. I overheard him telling the fella with the big muscles. Oh, yes, I saw him. He's got a nice tan, too. I think he's from somewhere hot. Fancy him, do you? Well, he's a bit old for me. Shame. He could snog me any day. Just a snog, mind, because he does look a bit full of himself." Groggins was standing on the bottom step of the main staircase, fretting. Only 10 cragflingers had arrived, and there should have been 12. Splidge hadn't appeared, and Groggins knew that he was getting ready. The other missing guest was a tricky character, and the royal butler wasn't looking forward to seeing him. Secretly, Groggins hoped he wouldn't come at all. The sound of trumpets interrupted the old servant's train of thought. Everyone lifted their heads to the balcony, which overlooked the marble hall. 2 local lads, recruited from the Guddian Amateur Brass Band and dressed in resplendent heralds' costumes, blew a startlingly loud fanfare. Dinner was ready. "There he is!" nudged Freckles, jabbing her elbow into her friend's ribcage. "There, by the pillar at the back. Look!" The girls blinked a couple of times to make sure it was really him. He was no longer a scruffy, curly-haired kid. As if transformed by a fairy godmother, Splidge stood tall, elegant, and dignified. "Oh, blimey," said Lucy Longtrousers. "What is Splidge wearing?" "I dunno, but it looks really expensive." A dazzling golden frock coat hugged Splidge's boyish frame. As the candlelight struck the diamond-encrusted garment, it sparkled and showered the room in brilliant, refractive rays. To Splidge's relief, the call to dinner had been such an attention-grabber that his emergence from a side room had gone mostly unnoticed. The other cragflingers had rushed like a herd of hungry animals up the stairs to the throne room. "I feel terribly conspicuous dressed like this," Splidge said to the crag, squatting proudly on his shoulder. "You look regal," the crag complimented him. "That's a proper cragflinger's outfit." "Oh no, we've been spotted," Splidge cringed. "Those 2 waitresses, they're friends of mine." "Just wave to them gracefully. Remember, you are the Royal Cragflinger now." "They're going to take the mickey out of me something rotten, I just know it." "Never mind, you need to focus on tonight. Hang back a bit and allow everyone else to get seated, and then make a big entrance." "What?" "The king wants to show you off. You have to impress all the cragflingers so they believe that you are the best cragflinger in the land." "Do I have to? It feels silly." "You will be fine. Come on, pull yourself together. You can do it." Once the stragglers had made their way up the stairs and into the throne room, Splidge followed. He was a nervous wreck. "How old do you suppose this coat is?" Splidge asked. "At least 300 years. It is the king's most prized possession. It's been handed down from generation to generation, like a family heirloom." "Fancy keeping it locked up in that turret all this time." "The king wants to keep it safe. They say the person who won the very first cragflinger competition was presented with it all those years ago." Groggins, standing by the entrance to the throne room, motioned for Splidge to wait. "Well, I must say, you do look the part, Master Fabble. It fits you very well." "Thank you, Groggins. I just feel a bit of a fraud." The old servant chuckled softly and patted the boy's shoulder. "Just do your best, lad." The undulating flab of the oversized ruler of Gud lowered into his chair of office at the head of the banqueting table. The king took his seat just before the fanfare, and he glanced out of the window into the night. The rain was lashing down, but lightning flashes were fewer and the thunder muted. The Royal Guard worried whether the makeshift repairs to the roof would hold. So far, hardly any water had penetrated the temporary patch-up job, so the relieved king turned to observe the competitors as they filed in. King Guddamac was dressed to impress. He wore a dark green tunic and had a splendid red robe draped over his shoulders, and a gold chain hung around his neck. He nodded solemnly as everyone entered, and they bowed respectfully to him. The Cragflingers stood behind their allocated seats, waiting for permission to be seated. With the slightest hint of a wave, King Guddamac gave the signal, and a loud scraping of chairs followed. An excited babble of voices broke out as everyone sat down. The Crags scuttled off to their smaller table, where they sat obediently waiting to eat. A herald, with what can only be described as the longest post horn in Gud, stepped forward. He raised the brass instrument, puckered his lips, and blew like a warthog. The deafening din was not harmonious, but it did announce the arrival of someone very important, and at that moment Groggins thrust Splidge through the door. Dressed in his impressive frock coat, Splidge walked self-consciously towards the banqueting table. Everyone gazed at the boy in his dazzling attire. He was the Royal Cragflinger, and they would have to try and beat him during the tournament in a fortnight's time. The king beamed and started to clap, with the others taking their cue to do likewise. Stuffing a hard-boiled egg into his mouth, Snotty, still wedged up in the rafters, was gobsmacked at his friend's appearance. "Blimey, nice coat," he gasped under his breath, sending egg crumbs falling onto the head of a tanned Cragflinger 15 feet below. There were 2 vacancies at the table, one for the competitor who was either late or not coming, and the other, directly opposite the king, for Splidge. The boy pulled out his chair and was about to sit down when a noise from the landing, sounding like a small army marching up the stairs, grabbed everyone's attention. The throne room door flew open, sending the trumpeter flying so that he nearly impaled himself on his elongated post horn. 5 figures, dressed in black, stormed into the royal chamber. The group paused to observe the startled occupants, who stared back at them open-mouthed. A large, ugly man with deep-set piggy eyes and a burnt scalp stepped forward. Splidge froze, recognising Pigface. Their eyes met just long enough for the bully to sneer at the lad. Pigface lurched forward, his plate-like feet slapping down on the marble tiles. He bowed to the king, then addressed the guests. "Your Royal Guddiness, ladies and gentlemen." His voice was deep and guttural, and globules of saliva shot from his lips as he spoke. "Please forgive our late arrival. I wish to present the proprietor of the Gudium Brewery, the innovator and creator of Baron's Bitter, his humble and obedient servant and fellow cragflinging contender, Baron Giles Throgmorton." If applause was expected, none was forthcoming. Those seated were too stunned by the grotesque spectacle to offer any kind of welcome. Stepping from behind Pigface, who looked even more like a medieval hangman than the attendant of nobility, came another curious specimen of human deformity. Baron Throgmorton wore a close-fitting black leather tunic with tight trousers to match. A wide belt was wrapped around his waist and secured by a gaudy silver buckle. Strands of silver hair swept back over his skull like a row of bloodless veins, and his lips were painted the colour of coal. His pencil-thin eyebrows grew too high on his pale forehead, and were shaped like arrowheads. After all the grooming and attempts to beautify himself, the Baron could never be described as handsome. His sunken cheeks, pointed chin and hooked nose did little to soften his features. The king's half-brother took centre stage. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he purred, with a sickly saccharine voice, requiring absolute silence to be heard. He paused for a moment, and his black, pitiless eyes surveyed the room. Then, with surprising speed, he bowed. It was an unusual sight. He bent from the waist as if hinged like a door, keeping his back ramrod straight. Bringing his nose within an inch of the ground, he waited for a millisecond before snapping back, bolt upright. "I must tell you what a pleasure it is to be here. My half-brother does us all proud with his sumptuous spread to welcome those who have picked up the gauntlet to take part in the royal tournament." Splidge, who had not yet taken his seat, was mesmerised. There was a definite presence emanating from the speaker, as well as a commanding air of confidence and magnetism. "You all know me, of course," the Baron continued. "Many have friends or relations who work for me. Many have tasted and enjoyed my phenomenal ale, Baron's Bitter, doubtless on tap here tonight." His thin face smiled. "But there are a few not familiar to me." The Baron looked directly at Splidge, who shuffled awkwardly on the spot, wishing that he'd already sat down. "Fear not, young man, we shall have plenty of time to become acquainted before the tournament begins. I shall make it my duty to get to know you better." The Baron took a few steps towards the lad, raising his long, thin legs unnaturally high, as if stalking his prey. He circled round him and leered, admiring the frock-coat. "It is an honour to meet the newly appointed Royal Cragflinger. My assistant Brute has told me of your encounters, and I gather you are the best of friends." Splidge found the idea repellent and wanted to move away, but the paralysis of fear rooted him to the spot. Still entranced by the ancestral garment, the Baron brushed his hand against the exquisite fabric, and Splidge found his skeletal fingers and his exceptionally long black nails quite horrific. With self-assured smugness, the gruesome brewer drew his pallid face close to the petrified lad and grinned. Splidge fought back a gagging reflex. The man's rank breath was foul and churned his stomach. He wanted to vomit, but somehow held eye contact with the vile man. Abruptly, Baron Throgmorton withdrew and returned to the centre of the room. His speech wasn't over yet. "I am very much looking forward to the contest this year, and it is my intention that, no matter how much resistance you put up, I shall be the victor." He flashed his rotten teeth. "Before I join you at the table, I would like to introduce you to my crag, a friendly little pet which, unfortunately for you, will eliminate your pathetic vermin from the contest." Baron Throgmorton clicked his fingers, and out from the sinister group stepped the girl with the long, raven-coloured hair. She'd been hidden by the other two henchmen, so Splidge hadn't spotted her before. He watched as she crossed to the Baron. No one else was paying her much attention, for they were gaping at the cage she clasped in her hands. Clearly visible, and firmly tethered to the bars, was an angry-looking, muscular crag. Its body was completely shaven, and tattoos covered its leathery skin. It snarled viciously like a wild animal, hungry for flesh. The girl herself wasn't looking at anyone. After showing off the gruesome creature, she handed the metal cage to one of the henchmen, who, with obvious reluctance, took it from her, being careful where he put his fingers. The monster snapped and growled some more. "And this lovely creature," the Baron resumed, "is my daughter, Mistress Doreen." The girl, looking uncomfortable, smiled. The Baron clapped his hands, and without hesitation, Mistress Doreen turned and walked out of the room, the other henchmen following her at her sides like specially trained puppy dogs. It was time for the king to say something. He had kept quiet and regarded the unfolding drama with disinterest. He was not at all impressed by his half-brother's crude performance. "Giles,"
Enough of this tomfoolery. Take your place and sit down, will you? We are eager to get on and enjoy the feast whilst it is still hot.
The Baron twitched, as if a small chink in the brewer's armour had been exposed. The reptilian man sneered at the king, then sat without a murmur. Carelessly he had lowered himself into Splidge's chair, and a smirk stole onto the Baron's face when he realised that the Royal Cragflinger was now forced to sit alongside the other contestants. With everyone finally seated, the king signalled for the feast to commence. In a flurry of urgency, an army of waitresses filtered into the throne room, carrying pewter bowls on large polished trays. On the journey from the kitchen, 3 floors below, some of the soup had slopped over the sides of the bowls, and they had to be cleaned up before placing in front of the guests. Freckles couldn't resist, and she poked her finger into the red soup. She swilled it round and popped it into her mouth, sucking the delicious spicy liquid. Tomato! Lovely! Freckles! cooed Lucy Longtrousers in mock horror. Freckles grinned. It's a shame we don't have this at home. It's delicious. Groggins snapped his fingers, and the 2 waitresses smiled sweetly at him before delivering the bowls to the table. Splidge was eager to get scoffing. He picked up his spoon and, remembering his manners, took a crafty peek around the table. He wasn't sure of royal protocol, but was relieved to find the other Cragflingers already slurping the warming food. It was the first time Splidge had had the chance to study his competitors. They were a strange bunch. On his left sat a plump woman in a hideous pink dress with a necklace of wooden baubles. She was spooning her soup so fast it dribbled down her chin and onto her ample bosom. Next to her sat a hunched individual who ate mechanically as if he was a robot. Beyond him sat a much older gentleman with flaky, wrinkled skin and an impossibly long, grey, curly beard. Then there was a rotund, pimply fellow who, with his ferocious appetite, polished off the soup in seconds and dragged his fat tongue around the sides of the bowl, making sure nothing had escaped. A blob of wax plopped onto the table. Splidge looked up and saw Snotty dangling by his legs from an overhead beam. The sooty boy was gurning like a demented acrobat. "How's it going, mate?" Snotty mouthed silently. Splidge spluttered, almost spewing the soup from his mouth. He signalled discreetly for his friend to go away. Silence reigned, which seemed odd to Splidge, for when he was young his parents enjoyed having dinner parties. They were not as formal as the banquet, but there was plenty of chatter, laughter and jokes. It was fun. Yet all that emanated from this table was the sipping of drinks and the slurping of soup. The only other sound filling the air was the chomping of 11 hungry crags as they munched their beloved werble nuts. Their sharp incisors cracked open the shells and expertly extracted the nut. The savoury taste sent each crag into convulsions of pleasure. The hairy mock creatures muttered to one another in a language all of their own. "Did you see the caged monster?" one said. "Yeah, but I thought it had been banished," said another. "Banished? What for?" said Splidge's orange crag. "I thought you knew," said a pink fluffy crag. "It murdered its owner." "Did it really?" went up a cry. "Yeah, I heard that too," said the first crag again. "Ate him alive, they say." "No wonder it's in a cage," said the orange crag. "And we have to compete with that at the royal tournament?" The pink crag scowled. "My master will have a thing or two to say about that." "Did you see its tattoos?" said another crag, after scoffing one of the biggest werble nuts it could find. "Yeah," moaned the first. "What kind of crag has shaved skin and tattoos?" "The murdering kind?" ventured the orange mock creature. The other crags looked at it with trepidation before they all went back to their munching. Splidge was thinking about the ghastly monster too. It looked terrifying, and he was pleased it wasn't eating with the other crags. He wondered where it had been taken, and then thought more about the raven-haired girl. Now that he was 12 and considered a man, he would be expected to take a wife soon. His mother would want him to find a nice, pretty girl. But what would she make of Mistress Doreen?
Splidge could almost hear her voice. "A girl like that will only bring you trouble. Stay away from her at all costs." Splidge loved his mother very much and knew that she was always right. So he made up his mind he would avoid Mistress Doreen. Although she was very pretty, he wouldn't look at her ever again. Splidge turned his attention to Baron Throgmorton. He was an odd character, egotistical, self-centred and highly opinionated. But now he was very subdued. Splidge watched him surreptitiously as he ate his soup. The Baron's piercing eyes shot this way and that, as if waiting for something to happen. At one point their eyes met. The young Cragflinger couldn't return the gaze for more than a second. It felt as if the Baron was reading his mind like a book. The lad quickly turned back to his soup and realised that it had all gone. A feeling of dread came over him, and suddenly he didn't want to be there any more.